Let's start with the third session. So I will introduce the speakers. And the first speaker will be José Antao, who is the NCP of Research Infrastructure in Portugal. He will talk about a little bit about the program. Probably he will present also some case study, yes? More or less. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you all for being here, resisting lunch, and thank you for WideNet for the invitation. Short lunch. Yes, maybe some people still going to join us after it. So I have prepared some presentation here to show you some context on the funding of the life cycle of research infrastructures. I have prepared this in collaboration with Gloria Vilar, who is my colleague from Spain. So it's an international project here. And we are doing this here in large part because Gloria was very instrumental in preparing a symposium earlier this year on the funding mechanisms for research infrastructures, which is a bit of an overlapping theme to this same workshop. I would like to start actually by defining what research infrastructures are. And we have had the presentation from Carlo Risuto, and it's unfortunate that he's not here, but at the same time, I can't take the liberty to correct something that he said, which I wouldn't if he were still here. He defined the research infrastructures basically as facilities, and research infrastructures in the context that we are thinking of today in the European research area are not just facilities. They're facilities, but they're also services and resources that are used by the research community to conduct research and foster innovation. So if you think of a collection, for instance, of animal models or genotypes from plants or whatever, those can also be considered as research infrastructures under the Commission's definition. Also, the digital infrastructure that enables the working of these days with all the big data that is being generated in the more traditional types of infrastructure that people usually recognize, such as ELI that was presented here, or particle accelerators, or research vessels, or whatever. So all of these have to be considered in the European landscape as research infrastructures, and we need funding for all of those. Also, they can be single-sited, of course, if they're located, if it's a major equipment, like if you think of the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, it's a single-sited research infrastructure. If you think of, for instance, I don't know, the network of research vessels, it's a distributed, there's several in different countries. Or they can be virtual if they're the research infrastructures, for instance, on intensive computing or the data infrastructure in general. So why do we need to coordinate the European infrastructure in general? So I was happy actually with Carlos' presentation that I think it was the first one that mentioned the phrase European research area. And I think this is a concept that we have to keep in mind when we think about the synergies of funds, because it's not just the funds, is the objective that we have to keep in mind is that we want to create this European research infrastructure. And we need to open access to the existing research infrastructures that may be located in just a few places, but to open them to all of the community of researchers and innovators in Europe. So we need to coordinate this at European level, also because we need to avoid duplication of efforts. So we don't need to build 5 large-scale synchrotrons in different places in Europe or particle accelerators, but we need to coordinate that countries interested participate in the ones that can serve the whole community and provide for access to all the research community. So also because they're the best grounds for exchange of best practice that can be transmitted between the different actors in the innovation and research ecosystem. And we need to generate the way to get data that is generated to be interoperable and reusable, particularly these days with the policy of open access and open innovation and open science, in Europe. So, how are they planned? You have heard mentions to the ESFRI roadmap. ESFRI is a group that has representatives from all of the European countries and associated countries. And what they do is they do the landscape and gap analysis, identify the needs of the research community, and they prioritize the investments in research infrastructure for Europe. You can then, I think you're going to have access to this presentation, so then you can follow the links here and you can go and check which infrastructures are there and how the process is conducted. At the same time that we have the European planning, we also have in the different member states the national roadmaps of research infrastructures, and here already you have a hint at the combination of different mechanisms for planning and for financing research infrastructures. So this is the Portuguese roadmap. You can find it online, but if you go to follow this link, you'll find the roadmaps for your own countries, and you get all the information there of the prioritizations that you have found in your own countries that will be aligned with ESFRI. And why do we need to combine funds then? So if you think about the budget that you'd need to operate and build the research infrastructures that are in the ESFRI roadmap, the latest version from this year already, you'd see this is an underestimation, but maybe it would be around 26 billion euros. Of course, you can think that, okay, Horizon 2020 has almost 80 billion, so we can cover for that. But then research infrastructures are considered under the scientific excellence pillar. There's only 24.4 billion there, so it's not enough to cover everything. Research infrastructures are only 2.5 billion of those. And if you look at the calls that are dedicated to funding the development of research infrastructures, it's less than 1 billion indicative numbers. So you can say, well, we definitely need to combine funds, but really what you need is to get funds from elsewhere, because the percentage of the funding you get from Horizon 2020 is really ludicrous, considering all the money you need. So more than 95% of the budget needed to build and operate the research infrastructures does not come from Horizon 2020. And that's a bit of what I was trying to get into when I said, well, we are not looking strictly as the combination of funds. We have some combination of funds, but what we need is to look at what roles are there for what is funded under Horizon 2020 versus what is funded from other sources. This is a schematic that helps you look at the life cycle of a research infrastructure. So you go through different steps of development, design, implementation, operation, termination. Termination is increasingly being talked about because everything that starts then comes to an end also, and we need to make provisions for what's going to happen and how we are going to decommission research infrastructures. And you can see also here that you have two types of research infrastructures, one that involves new construction and one that involves the federation or coordination of research infrastructures that already exist in the different countries. That's a more common one, the bottom one, that we find the different national infrastructures, and we create an umbrella organization that will coordinate the action of all of those. And you can see that the amounts of money that are required to go through each of those stages is different. And mostly you have a concentration of funding here, what is called their implementation, but mostly is for construction, and particularly of the new single-sited large research facilities. So where does Horizon 2020 come? It comes here in the early stages of development and design and early implementation as well. So part of those stages actually is to study the mechanisms for the long-term sustainability of research infrastructures. And that requires that member states and regions are involved in the development of these research infrastructures. provisions also for economic activities of research infrastructures, the interaction with industry, even though it's traditionally something that is talked about but does not contribute a lot to the sustainability of research infrastructures, but is something that is being ramped up as something that needs to be considered more and more. And then there's also sometimes limited support for early operation of research infrastructures, but this is mostly on the provision of transnational access to researchers, and it's not a main source of financing. So again, going back to here, when I say that more than 95% of the funding for research infrastructures is not from Horizon 2020, and I say that the bottom option here is the most common, you can already see that the amounts of money that are involved are relatively small to what is needed to fund the life cycle of research infrastructures. So that's why we need to get funds from other parts. And I'm giving you an example, for instance, of EU Solaris. This is a distributed research infrastructure for concentrated solar power. It's coordinated by Spain. I'm showing you here the two participants from Portugal. One of them is from a so-called developed region, which is Lisbon, and the other one is from a less developed region. So at the national level, in our national roadmap, we have to take this into account, and the portions of money that go into financing this national node of the European infrastructure has to be accounted for, and there's a variable geometry of how much comes from the national budget, how much comes from the regions. And if you think this is already complicated, and it is, we have someone here from a region in Portugal that does not deal directly with this one because it's not in her region, but has to deal with other ones. Then you have to think about how this then integrates into the whole landscape in Europe. And you have all of these countries involved, and some of them are not even member states. You have Turkey and Israel, for instance, here. And all of this has to be synchronized so that the European research infrastructure finds the way of governance and funding mechanisms that can sustain its existence. If you're interested in talking more about this, actually, Teresa Jorge, who's here, she's part of a project that he's just going to start probably the beginning of next year, and she's responsible for a work package on the synchronization of national roadmaps and finding the ways to get the different streams of funding to be incorporated in something like this. So, well, she's there. You can find her. So to synthesize, this is a slide from Octavio Quintana from the Commission, and it's a bit more complicated than it needs to be, but just briefly, Horizon 2020, you can see here on this red line, is good for financing design, preparatory phases, everything that goes on during the S3 process. Then on the construction, the line dips, and you get structural funds coming in. You can also get structural funds to finance the human capital, the part of the training, and that's part of the structural funds also where it can intervene. And then during operation, that's an overestimation. Usually there's not a big contribution of Horizon 2020. There has to be other mechanisms found for financing. Finally, I would like to present just an extra instrument that was also presented in our symposium earlier in Madrid this year, and that's a liquidity instrument. And as you can see, if you see that a lot of the investment, the funds are needed here at the phase of construction, there can be a liquidity problem because you need to put a lot of money at once, and then you are only going to recover that with the income of the research infrastructure at a later stage. You can also get EIB funding, European Investment Bank. In this case, this is from the synchrotron at Grenoble. And they got 65 million from the EIB, which they are going to pay over time as their income builds up. So you can find, when I have these links for the name of the person, you can go to their presentation at our symposium in Madrid. So that's all I had to say. That's my contact if you need to get in touch. You can also get the link to the research infrastructures and CPs from your own countries. And you can visit our webpage where you can find all the information about the presentations and the video footage of all the things that we had at our symposium. I have a small video here, but I think it's probably over time now, so 2.5 or something. But do we have audio? It's not working. Yeah, don't worry. It's fine. You can find the link there, and then you can watch it. It's on the role of NCPs in our network, so that's a bit besides the point anyway. Thank you.